Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Forget everything you think you know about the Boston Tea Party. This wasn't some spontaneous student protest gone wrong. It was one of the most brilliant, high-stakes acts of political defiance in history. A single, destructive night that sealed the fate of a continent. Picture this. Boston, 1773. A freezing December night. A group of colonists dressed as Indians storms 3 ships and dumps 92,000 pounds of cargo into the harbor. Here's the crazy part. That tea? It was the cheapest tea on the market. This was not a protest about high prices. It was a calculated $1 million act of treason against the British Crown. So, if the tea was practically free, why did these patriots risk everything to destroy it? Because accepting that cheap tea meant surrendering the one principle they held most sacred, the right to self-governance. They saw freedom, or slavery, floating right there in the harbor. Tonight, we're digging deep into the real story. We'll uncover the secret corporate bailout that forced Britain's hand, the stubborn governor who refused to back down, and the simple, symbolic disguise that became the declaration of a new American identity. Get ready for history in its rawest form. This event didn't just precede the revolution, it made it inevitable. Hit that subscribe button, buckle up, and let's find out how wet tea launched a war. The Boston Tea Party, an epoch in history. How cheap tea ignited a revolution. Prologue. Tea, tax, and the brewing storm. For over a decade, leading up to the infamous night of December 16, 1773, the Anglo-American colonies were engaged in a steadily escalating political and economic war with the British mother country. The conflict revolved not so much around the amount of money due, but around the fundamental principle of constitutional law. No taxation without representation. Colonists conceded Parliament's right to regulate imperial trade, but they vehemently rejected its right to impose internal taxes, as they had no elected representatives sitting in Westminster. By the early 1770s, after a wave of protests and boycotts, the British Parliament had repealed most of the hated Townshend Acts. However, to preserve the appearance of imperial sovereignty, one seemingly minor duty remained in force: a 3-pence tax per pound of tea imported into the colonies. In London, this was viewed as an unassailable confirmation of Parliament's right to govern all aspects of imperial life. In Boston, this duty, however minuscule, was a constant, irritating reminder of political disenfranchisement. Less than 24 hours after the waters of Boston Harbor had swallowed 340 chests of Chinese tea, the lawyer and patriot John Adams recorded a prophetic realization in his diary. This is the most magnificent movement of all. There is a dignity, a majesty, a sublimity in this last effort of the patriots that I greatly admire. Adams immediately grasped that the destruction of property was so bold, so daring, so firm, intrepid, and inflexible, that its consequences would be important and lasting, marking it as an epoch in history. The central question we must address is this: why did this act of property destruction, seemingly directed against a tax that actually made the product cheaper, become the decisive step toward armed revolution? 2. The economic gambit, the paradox of cheap tea. 2.1. The East India Company's crisis and the Crown's bailout. To understand the Boston Tea Party, we must first look at the dire straits of the East India Company, EIC, in 1772 to 1773. The EIC was a colossal yet grossly mismanaged and corruption-ridden conglomerate that controlled vast territories in India. By 1773, the company was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, with its English warehouses overflowing with an excess of approximately 17 million pounds of unsold tea. For British Prime Minister Lord North, the collapse of the EIC was unthinkable. The company was too big to fail, and its demise threatened to destabilize the entire imperial financial system. Parliament was compelled to intervene, granting the EIC a massive state loan in exchange for greater government oversight of its Indian holdings. Saving the EIC necessitated the immediate sale of its surplus tea. To this end, the Tea Act was passed in May 1773. This act granted the EIC a near monopoly on the direct sale of tea to the American colonies. The company could ship its tea and sell it through its own agents, consignees, bypassing British wholesalers and, critically, avoiding the customs duties typically levied in Great Britain. 2.2. Debunking myth. A protest of principle, not price. A widespread yet false myth is that the colonists protested because the British tax made tea prohibitively expensive. Analysis shows the opposite. By eliminating several intermediate fees, the Tea Act made the official EIC tea cheaper than the smuggled tea commonly supplied by the Dutch. This establishes the central paradox of the Tea Party. The protest was not economic, but ideological and political. From the Patriots' perspective, accepting this cheap tea meant tacitly agreeing to three dangerous precedents. First, it would acknowledge Parliament's right to tax the colonies, that symbolic 3-pence duty, without representation. Second, it would legitimize parliamentary monopolies that could crush local commerce, including the large-scale smuggling operations run by leaders like John Hancock. Third, it would undermine the entire decade-long struggle for constitutional rights. John Adams brilliantly articulated this dilemma, noting that allowing the tea to be landed would be giving up the principle of taxation by parliamentary authority and would subject Americans forever to Egyptian taskmasters, to burthens, indignities, to poverty and servitude. Thus, destroying the tea was the only way to protect the fundamental principle of liberty when all peaceful avenues were exhausted. Third, Hutchinson and the Siege of the Port, the catalyst. Political tensions reached a breaking point when, in late November and early December 1773, 3 EIC tea ships, Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver, arrived in Boston Harbor. A fourth ship, William, ran aground off Cape Cod. In other colonies, such as New York and Philadelphia, radical groups successfully persuaded or intimidated the captains and EIC agents to turn the ships around and sail back to England. Boston became the conflict's flashpoint because Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson took an uncompromising stand. 3.1. The Governor's Intransigence. Thomas Hutchinson was not only a staunch loyalist, but also a man with a personal stake. 2 of his sons were consignees, agents for the incoming tea. When John Hancock and Samuel Adams organized massive meetings demanding that the Dartmouth's captain return to England, Hutchinson firmly refused. He used his executive power to prohibit all ships from leaving the harbor until the 20-day legal deadline for paying customs duties had expired. By December 16, 1773, that deadline was imminent. Hutchinson had effectively turned Boston Harbor into a political siege, making either the unloading or the destruction of the tea the only possible outcomes. 3.2. The Backlash of the Hutchinson Letters. The governor's intransigence was compounded by a preceding scandal. In 1773, a collection of Hutchinson's private letters, written earlier in 1768 to 1769, were leaked, a distribution organized by Benjamin Franklin. In these letters, Hutchinson had urged the British government to tighten imperial control and abridge colonial rights. The publication of these letters in the Boston press caused a furious outcry, confirming the colonists' suspicion that Hutchinson was actively working toward their enslavement. This scandal completely eroded his authority. When thousands of townspeople gathered at the Old South Meeting House on the evening of December 16, 1773, only to be told once again that Hutchinson had refused their final demand, Samuel Adams uttered the critical phrase that signaled the start of action. "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." 4. The December night, an act of calculated destruction. 4.1 Discipline and Scale. Immediately following the signal that authorized radical action, a disciplined group of activists, estimated to be between 100 and 200 members of the Sons of Liberty, headed for Griffin's Wharf. They were disguised as Mohawk or Narragansett Indians. The operation was swift and highly organized. Over the course of 3 hours, they boarded the 3 vessels, Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver, and, using axes, broke open 340 chests of tea. The total weight of the destroyed cargo, a mix of Bohea black tea and green tea from the Chinese province of Anhui, exceeded 92,000 pounds. Today, the value of that cargo is estimated at approximately $1.7 million. A remarkable aspect of the night was its rigorous discipline. This was not an uncontrolled riot. The only property destroyed was the EIC's tea. Participants ensured that nothing else was damaged. There were no recorded instances of violence or confrontation with the ship crews or the British soldiers garrisoned in Boston. As one participant, George Hughes, recalled afterward, "Everyone quietly retired to our several places of residence without having any conversation with each other." 4.2 Debunking Myth. 2. The true meaning of the disguise. The common perception of the disguise as merely a means of avoiding arrest requires clarification. While participants certainly sought to conceal their identities from authorities, as they faced severe punishment for treason if caught, dressing as Mohawk and Narragansett Indians carried a much deeper symbolic meaning. The participants, many of whom were otherwise recognizable, knew the disguise offered imperfect anonymity. By donning Indian dress, the colonists deliberately distanced themselves from British identity, proclaiming their affinity with the American continent. It was a powerful statement to the world that they no longer considered themselves British subjects, but identified as Americans. This symbolic rejection of the mother country foreshadowed the actual political separation that would occur just a few years later. An epoch in history, retribution and unification. 1 British shock and the Punitive Acts. When news of the unprecedented destruction of private property reached London in January 1774, the reaction from the British establishment was shock, which quickly escalated into rage. Initially, King George III mistakenly believed it was merely a temporary misbehavior instigated by a few Boston hotheads. However, as official reports poured in from the EIC and Governor Hutchinson, the scale and audacity of the act became evident. Parliament viewed the Boston Tea Party not merely as a protest, but as an act of high treason and a direct assault on the Crown's sovereignty. In response, Parliament passed a series of punitive measures designed to punish Massachusetts and restore order. In the colonies, these laws became known as the Intolerable Acts. In Britain, they were called the Coercive Acts. These laws were intended to isolate and destroy Boston, forcing the colony into submission. Boston Port Act, March 1774. Closed Boston Harbor to all commerce, except food and fuel, until the colony reimbursed the EIC for the destroyed tea. Massachusetts Government Act effectively revoked Boston's elected local government. Administration of Justice Act allowed British officials accused of crimes while enforcing the new acts to avoid trial in the colony by moving the process to Great Britain or another colony. Quartering Act required colonial authorities to provide housing for British troops in unoccupied buildings. 2. Debunking Myth. 3. Impunity and Solidarity. Despite the gravity of the crime, classified as treason by the British Attorney General, and the presence of British troops in Boston, the authorities were virtually powerless. Myth. Such a brazen crime must have resulted in mass arrests and harsh penalties. Fact. Of the hundreds of participants in the Boston Tea Party, only one man, Francis Akeley, was ever arrested and imprisoned for his participation. This fact demonstrates the astonishing ineffectiveness of British control and, more importantly, the unprecedented solidarity among Bostonians. The Tea Party participants kept their secret for decades. Mass arrests were impossible because the entire local law enforcement and judicial system either sympathized with the Patriots or was paralyzed by their organized unity. Thus, the lack of punishment was clear evidence that British authority in Massachusetts existed only on paper by the end of 1773. 6. Epilogue. Unification and Revolution. Instead of isolating and suppressing Boston, as Lord North intended, the coercive acts had the opposite effect. They served as the catalyst for unifying the colonies. The other colonies saw the punishment of Massachusetts as a threat to their own autonomy, realizing that London could apply similar draconian measures to any other port if left unchecked. Boston received widespread support. Colonial governments, some of which, like Virginia, were dissolved by their governors for outspoken support, declared days of fasting and expressed solidarity. Furthermore, other tea parties took place in New York, Maryland, and South Carolina, confirming the continent-wide dissatisfaction. The key response to imperial retribution was the convening of the First Continental Congress in Carpenter's Hall, Philadelphia, from September to October 1774. The Congress, which effectively became the first united colonial government, devised a plan for economic unity, the Continental Association, intended to achieve the repeal of the coercive acts through a comprehensive boycott of British goods. The Boston Tea Party, by provoking the intolerable acts, led to irreversible escalation. Less than 18 months after the destruction of the tea, the first shots of the American Revolution were fired at Lexington and Concord in April 1775. When the 13 United States of America declared their independence in July 1776, they explicitly referenced the intolerable acts, Britain's response to the Boston Tea Party, as one of the primary justifications for their break with the Crown, citing the monarch for obstructing the administration of justice, cutting off their trade, and imposing taxes on them without their consent. The Boston Tea Party, therefore, was not an act of drunken vandalism, but a carefully planned, symbolic, and politically essential act. It was driven by a combination of imperial financial need, saving the EIC, the local governor's intractable obstinacy, and the colonists' unyielding commitment to the principle of constitutional liberty. This event did not just precede the revolution, it made it inevitable. So, there you have it. The Boston Tea Party, a masterful political chess move that wasn't about the price of tea, but about the cost of freedom. It showed the Crown that the colonists would never accept taxation without representation, even if the goods were practically given away. The resulting coercive acts were supposed to crush Boston, but they did the opposite. They became the glue that fused 13 separate colonies into one revolutionary unit. This single night of defiant destruction was the true starting gun for the American Revolution. But what do you think? If you were standing in Boston that freezing December night, would you have paid the cheap tax for convenience, or would you have grabbed an axe and joined the Mohawks at Griffin's Wharf? Let me know your stance in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed peeling back the layers on this massive moment in history, make sure you hit that like button. And if you want more deep dives into the hidden truths of the past, subscribe right now and ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next historical breakdown. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time right here on the Edge of History.